So thank you everyone who has been a part of and who is joining us for the public showcase of Constructing Personal Archives 2020. I think it became doubly special because we are using the month of May and the first week of May to celebrate this showcase, and this marks 3 years for curating for culture. So it became doubly special for us. I think with that, I should obviously introduce who I am, even for whoever might join later. Yeah, I'm only doing these things to focus on my work. Okay, so I am Ishita Shah. I'm trained as a designer and a historian, and I now proudly say that founded this collective Curating for Culture. I think it's the first time I'm saying this out loud or in a forum. I've always said I'm associated with it. So something more has happened thanks to all of you. And a lot of them who are not maybe right now joining us, but they have all the participants of different exhibitions, different programs have motivated us to do the work that we're doing. And as I keep saying, reminded us of the promise that we had made when we started. Moving on to the evening, the 2 days were planned not just for us to look at the exhibition, which you all have looked at, and they've really come out wonderfully. They're all experiential spaces, spaces of engagement, serving as of histories being told, not told. Still, there are things which are unsaid, which is beautiful. But I think it was also important to unpack why are we doing what we're doing. And I think this is the hidden historian who still continues to work behind the programming, I think. And hence we plan the days like this, that in the day we engage with the exhibition and with the spaces, and in the evenings we'll sit together and unpack and talk about. But we also don't need to make them very academic. The whole idea is to have more community conversations around why are we doing these projects, why do personal archives matter. And on that note, I would want to introduce the theme for today, which is archives as socio-political identities. I'm not going to bore you all to read out what I've written because I know you would have all read what was on the poster. I'll just tell you what sort of viewed for me, because there were these 8 continuing projects because of whom we are celebrating this day. And when we were to look at how they come together across 2 days, it was very interesting that most of these projects through the 6 months of incubation program asked a lot of questions about ethics, identity, treading into somebody's personal space or a community space. And even once you tread into it, how to step out of it, right? So that was one lingering thought as a moderator, which kept coming back to me. Personally, also, I have been working with various kinds of archiving projects. And one of the tools that I think I am very inclined to use is oral histories or ethnographic research behind archiving projects. And what that does also is raises questions about agency of the dead, agency of the person who is missing. It does it to me, perhaps, right? And these 2 questions together, when I saw through these 4 projects, Zannatun, Tonisha, Soni, and who is the 4th one? Sorry, I'm only forgetting. Who is the 4th one presenting today? Yes, Srinidhi, right? No, Srinidhi. So these 4 projects basically continuously brought out these questions again and again in their own ways through the workshop. And that's why it seemed like while you will listen to them, they're touching upon very different subject modalities. So while ecology is one focus and art practice in Bangladesh is another focus, you might wonder why are they together, right? And I'm sure I'm just raising this as a provocation, and this is why for us a keynote speech was very important. And that's been our interest and invitation to Urvashi, Butalia, to say that could you set the context? How would you interpret when I put this out as a provocation that archives as socio-political identities? How would you talk about them? And thanks, Urvashi. If we could move to Urvashi's camera. Yes. Urvashi, if you if you're comfortable to switch on your camera. Yes. So thank you, Urvashi, for accepting this invitation and taking on this as a task, because eventually we did realize that we gave our keynote speakers a task. It was not as easy as come and just present. Really, they had to read through these projects, that too sitting apart and doing this. I really don't know how capable I am to introduce Urvashi, but I'm just going to use something from the web. So Urvashi Butalia is an Indian feminist writer, publisher, and activist. She's known for her work in the women's movement of India, as well as for authoring books such as The Other Side of Violence, Voices from the Partition of India, and Speaking Peace, Women's Voices from Kashmir. She's also the founding director, member of Divan Books, who have also been doing quite groundbreaking work in similar areas of literature, creative interpretation, histories, and working with young realities. So she felt like the befitting person to take on this task, and she rather humbled. Thank you, Urvashi. Over to you.
Thanks, Ishita. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Yes, yeah. Okay. So thanks, everyone. And thank you for being here today. Thank you to Ishita for asking me. So what I'm going to say to you is a bit scattered because the circumstances in which this whole discussion came about were a bit like that. So when Ishita wrote and asked me to speak today, we had a few mishaps in communication. And it wasn't until I was actually getting ready to leave for a week away abroad that I finally managed to see her emails, which kept disappearing into the ether somewhere. And although I knew that I would not really have time to think seriously and do this while I was traveling, and I have been all over the place and doing bits and pieces of work, I didn't want to say no because the project itself is so very interesting that I thought, okay, I'll give it a go. So I hope that you will excuse me if this keynote doesn't make any grand claims, but I'm glad of the opportunity to share some thoughts with you on similar work that all of us are engaged in or interested in. So to begin with, I watched the short presentations that everyone has prepared on your projects, and I find them really totally fascinating. I've read the briefs about the work that you're doing, and it's important for me as an oral historian and somebody whose life is really dedicated to the question of building archives in different ways, to just mark some of the things that struck me in general about the work that you're doing. I think first, the most important thinking is the most important thing really is the context. So the context that enables thinking about ways in which the personal, the intimate, the close needs to be valued and recorded, and that this thinking for you, particularly from what Ishita says, began in the time of the pandemic, a sort of time out of time that reshaped so much of our thinking on all the issues that we normally take for granted. You know, things like time, home, routine, family, workplace, so much more. So when all of us were thrown on our own resources inside our homes, those of us who have the luxury to have homes which had spaces to accommodate us, all of these things had to be rethought. And for me, actually, not so much as an oral historian, but as an employer, this time out of time and its aftermath have been moments when I've had to rethink all the assumptions with which I entered a workspace, a feminist workspace. So I think it's very important that the genesis of many of your projects and thinking around curating personal archives came out of that time out of time, which pushed us back on our own resources. I think another thing that the pandemic did was to pull attention away from the so-called wider spheres, because I guess nothing within quotes newsworthy was happening in the outside world. And I'm using newsworthy in quotes as well, because I'm not agreeing with that definition, but saying to you that that is how we see it. That is how certain happenings, certain events are seen as being newsworthy or not newsworthy. And nothing much of that kind was happening in the outside world. And a lot was happening in the personal and intimate world. And so much of what people were living through in this time, because it wasn't seen as being worthy of entering the public sphere, was in danger of being lost. And so I imagine that for many of you who started also exploring personal archives at that time, um, it was the loss and absence of the public world and the activity that would happen in it, which turned our attention inwards. In my own work of many years ago, when I worked as a researcher on the partition of India, exploring personal archives and personal stories, your interventions pushed me to think back to that time and the context of that time. And I realized that my work is very tied into the time in which it began and the context that gave rise to it. So I began working on partition oral histories and building archives of those stories because the 1984 violence in the aftermath of Indira Gandhi's assassination shook me into an awareness of the histories of partition that we had more or less invisibilized. As one of hundreds of people who was working with NGOs and citizens groups at that time, what I began to hear at that time, and I put the word in quotes, was the stories of people who had been impacted by the violence. And that raised that question in my head of why it was that partition stories, which lived among us in the tellings inside families, had been given such little attention, especially by people of my generation who were first generation Indians post-partition and whose families, like my family, were actually partition refugee families. So when that history lives around you and you still ignore it because you are so trained to think of history as something that happens outside of your world, it was the context of 1984 that shook me into thinking of that. And this context or this moment tied in with my generation of people to whom partition was still real because we were born and grew up in its direct aftermath. And it was also a moment actually when the first or second generation after independence were kind of measuring, exploring, thinking about the meanings of independence and reflecting on it and looking at the histories around it. So that was a particular context which pushed me into doing that research in the personal sphere. In my workspace, which I don't really separate from the personal sphere, but there we did a couple of different things which also have a kind of bearing on the projects that you are doing. So I just want to mention them briefly. I'll start with the more recent thing of the pandemic. So like everybody else, we too had to go online during the pandemic. And a number of workshops that were slated with women's groups on the ground, where we hoped through the workshops to collect their histories of the kind of precarity of their lives, especially in relation to two subjects, work and violence. So suddenly those workshops were not going to happen. And how were we going to therefore do this? And in many ways, the answer came from many women's groups on the ground who offered to record their own stories on voice notes, on telephones, and send them to us so that we had them as a resource. Because as they said, if we don't tell our stories during this time, who will? Because the world out there is not really bothered about our stories. So again, it was a context of the pandemic that gave rise to this fairly innovative thinking of how to record certain stories. In Zuban, in the early years, we had put in place another archiving project, which was of a different nature altogether, which was to collect and map a visual history of the women's movement in India through the posters that women's groups had created in order to work through the many different campaigns that they were working through. And in this exercise, we worked collectively with 161 groups. And many issues came up, which I see reflected in the work that all of you are doing. For example, the question of ownership. Like when you're collecting personal histories from people, whose histories are they? Soni and her work with the library of Sindhi books, which has been handed to her by the daughters of the man who actually put the library together. She is the custodian of that. But what are her responsibilities in passing on those histories? When Srinidhi looks at the trunk that his grandfather had and the place where he found his grandmother's memories and papers, what is the responsibility that carries for him in a personal way? What is the responsibility it carries in a more public way? Because as long as the archive is maintained close to your heart and for yourself, it has a different meaning. And once it goes out into the public sphere, bigger questions of responsibility, representation, truth, ownership, all of these come up. So for us, when we were collecting posters from the women's movement, in a sense, the claims of ownership were clear because whichever group gave us those posters was the owner, or that was the provenance of those posters. But at the same time, the images, etc., used in those posters were crowdsourced by feminist collectives who did not necessarily believe in copyright. So how do you reconcile the political nature of the work you're doing and the outreach you wanted to have in certain ways out in the public world and the access you want to give it with the claims of ownership, etc., which might hold them back? And there are ways and ways of thinking about this. And I think that one of the things we tried to do was to make a distinction between, and this is a bigger archive than the personal archives you are collecting in your work. So perhaps those questions may be different for you. But in a sense, the way we tried to do it was, if anybody wished to use that material for educational purposes, it would be available for free. If they wish to use it for commercial purposes, we would charge a fee, which would be shared with the group that had given us the poster. And then it was up to that group to see further if there was a photographer or an artist or something who they wanted to pay. That was how we tried to work it, but it is an ongoing kind of struggle. The work that you are doing, I think it's very interesting because they mark several points, your projects mark several points of entry into the work of archiving. One of those is seeking to preserve a heritage, as in the Sindhi library, looking for clues to your history, as in the story of the trunk and the stories of grandmother and mother, and how to make sense of this heritage, or a bigger history, for example, the history of the tiger in the Sundarbans, and also the stories around that, and I first came to know quite recently, I have to say, a little bit embarrassing, but it's the truth, of the legends and stories around the tigers, which we got to know because we were offered a manuscript called The Honey Hunter, which was a story of children, and it was about a young boy who was a honey hunter and who built a kind of relationship with the tiger in the forests. So this question of human beings and animals, which you're raising through that project, is also very, very interesting. And then there is, of course, the very deeply personal thing where you want to create something out of an archive that you have of memories, and you want that for your own family, something to hand on and into your own family so that those memories don't entirely disappear. And in one way, I think your entry points are personal, political, historical, and they have the potential, and I think this is a very subversive potential, to basically upturn and question the given meanings of history. What is history? Is it only the great big things that happen outside of us? Or is it something that happens in our lives? Or is there a way that we can combine the two? One of the questions that I have constantly asked in my work is, what happens to history or histories when they escape the bounds of disciplines and go out into the world? What happens to them when they are democratized? What happens to them when they are no longer the property of the historian who has been trained in the discipline of history, but they become the domain of all of us, people, citizens who have a right to what is called history. And there, I think what's the interesting thing you're doing is creating different kinds of knowledge, and therefore also subverting the meanings of what is considered knowledge. I want to tell you a little story here that I came across in my work on partition. You may have heard of it, or if you read something I've written, I may have written about it. So forgive me if I'm repeating it, but I think in some ways it touches on many of the subjects that you are looking at. And this is a story of a man called Rashpal, who I only met long after this story unraveled, but who wrote to me out of the blue one day. And I got this email in my inbox, and it kind of sent a chill into my heart for the search that he was making. So his story is something like this, that Rashpal was a 10-month-old infant at the time of partition, and his extended family was fleeing to safety towards Amritsar from what became Pakistan. He had some uncles, his mother's brothers, who lived in Amritsar, and I think the entire family was fleeing. At some point in their flight, they were seeking a safe passage, and there were 2 or 3 possibilities. And so the group stopped, and the 3 men who were with the group were sent off to do a recce to find which was the safest spot to cross over. One of those 3 men was Rashpal's father. And by the time those men returned individually, separately, an attack had taken place, and pretty much everybody in that group had been killed, including Rashpal's mother and sister and several of his relatives. He was still alive. He had been hit on the neck and shoulder with a machete and then thrown on the ground, and he didn't die. After the attack was over, there was a young man who was actually Rashpal's uncle, who was 16 at the time, who had hid himself and survived. And he decided, once the attack was over, to move. And as he moved, he saw this infant lying on the ground, and he saw that the infant was alive. So he picked him up and rolled him in his pagdi and then brought him to Amritsar and put him in a hospital where the young man too was admitted. Months later, 2 months later, Rashpal's mother's brothers, going from hospital to hospital to find survivors of that attack, found him. And they took him home, and they adopted him and made him their son. And he grew up with 3 brothers who had similar names, Rajinder, Tejinder, Satinder, something like that, as Punjabi families have. But his name was different. And he grew up with people asking him all the time, why is your name different? But he had no answer to that question. His father, meanwhile, the one who had been sent out to do a recce, had survived, had come back, found that the attack had killed everyone, and he had then made his way via another route to Gurdaspur, which is near Amritsar, where Rashpal had been adopted by his uncles and was living there. So the father came at some stage to his brother-in-law's place, found his son, but was not allowed to tell him that he was his real father, because the child grew up with people he thought were his real parents, who were his adoptive parents. Anyway, all this went on. Rashpal grew up. He didn't know his history at all. As a man, he moved to America. And it was when he was in the United States teaching, married with children of his own, that one day he got a phone call from Gurdaspur to say that his father had died and left him some property, and could he come there? And this man was his real father. That was when he discovered his real history, that this man, his real father, had been alive all these years, living in a village or town 2 hours away from him, but he had never seen him, barring that one time that he had come to visit, and when Rashpal didn't know he was his real father. And by this time, Rashpal's adoptive family had all died. So he had no way of recovering that history. And for him, the sense of loss, of betrayal, of not being anchored, of not being able to locate your history, they were eating him up. And then we spent years, little by little, trying to trace that history. And eventually it reached a closure or a resolution when he found And I shan't go into that long process, but he found many parts of that history. But he was also able to go back to the place in Pakistan, which was now Pakistan, where the incident had happened. And there he was able to see that place, possibly imagine it, put a closure on it. I've taken some time to tell you this story, partly because I find it a very moving story, but partly also because here is an unexplored archive which is so linked to the wider history of partition, and which you cannot, once you hear it, dismiss as a small personal story. So this whole notion of what is small, what is large, what is worth recording, what is not, which your practice is questioning and subverting, I think, is a very exciting moment for those of us who are involved in the world of archiving. So I will try to now move to closing this a little bit with telling you one or two other stories. So I want to go back for a moment to what I said earlier about the time, the context in which your explorations grew. And when I was looking at your story, I was reminded of something else. So one of the hats that I wear is that of a teacher. And I teach a course in feminism at several universities, including Ashoka. One of the pillars around which that course is built is a group assignment that students are to do on any subject of their choice, drawn from whatever the course, whatever they think they've taken away from the course. During the pandemic, having to take classes online with students located in their homes, I had to rethink how to do this assignment because there was no possibility of them working in groups. And our thinking ended up being something like yours here, to look around you at the histories that lie in your intimate environments, in your private, close environments. So I asked the students to locate in their homes or their families or their immediate environments women, because our course is about women, and to talk to them about their stories. The purpose was quite similar to yours, to alert people that are all around us lie valuable histories and stories, and there's so much we can learn from them. Over 100 students began to look around them and to have conversations which they had never had before. For example, with their mothers. They had never talked to their mothers as people who carried a history, stories with them, with their grandmothers who had lived with them, with the domestics who worked in their homes and who had been really invisible to them. And there were some lovely stories that came out of it. I will mention only one because I could talk endlessly about them. And that was that one of the young men in my class, when he started talking to his mum, he found out that his mother had wanted to be a football player before she married, and marriage had put an end to all of that. But that behind their kitchen window was a football field. And he would often find her standing there and watching. And it wasn't until he started talking to her that he actually realized what was happening there. And subsequent to that, then began a process by which every other week or every month or something like that, at regular intervals, he would take his mother to the football field and they started kicking a ball around and she started to play football. And I thought to myself how wonderful the opening up of that story was and how transformative it was also for the people who had been involved in it, because it did what we never do and what your projects are doing, which is to see, within quotes, what lies in plain sight before us and to listen to all the stories that lie around us. So there's no doubt a huge value in what you're doing. And the key value is a question that in one way or the other, all of you raise. And in everything that I have watched from what you've sent me, that question comes up again and again in your YouTube discussions. And that is a question about knowledge. What is knowledge? Who gets to decide it? And in creating the kind of knowledge that we are doing, what are we doing? Are we questioning knowledge? Are we subverting it? Are we adding to it? But I think with knowledge comes another thing that we need to recognize in the creation of personal archives. And that is the sense of responsibility. That is the actual responsibility that it carries. I see that in the projects you're doing and the questions you're raising. And I see also that you've begun to address many of these things. But I just want to draw your attention to some of the things that became great cautions for me when I was, in the work that I do with archives. One of those was that people need to tell their stories. They often want to tell their stories, but often they are reluctant also to tell their stories. And some of their reluctance is very real, because they fear what the telling of that story will do once that story goes out into the public world, which raises, and by public, I don't only mean the great public, but even within your own family, which raises, I think, the question for you as representatives or as people who carry the responsibility of taking those stories into the world. How do you receive those stories? How do you take them into the world? Who do you make vulnerable through the taking of these stories? Whose truths do you privilege? By saying who do you make vulnerable, I mean, for example, one of the issues I was faced with was when I was trying to explore sexual violence during partition. At first, women did not want to talk about it. When they did, they were so fearful of making that condition of their lives public, because many had families who didn't know that at all. They were also unable often to tell those stories because they did not have the vocabulary to describe the deep sense of violation and hurt that they had felt, not only at the sexual assault, but at being abandoned by their families. So what do you do with those histories? Do you pursue some notion of truth that those histories must come out? Or do you actually look at the people around you and say, my responsibility is to them, and I have to find a way of telling that stories without making them vulnerable? And that is a question for people who are involved in certain kinds of archiving, not all of it, but certain kinds of archiving. You have already talked in your presentations about this, but the issue of consent, I think, is a big thing. And I think that there is so much potential in this kind of work that actually the question of how do you represent those histories that people trust you with, because it's also a question of trust. They hand over their lives to you in trust. And then you have to see where you want to take them. So I think that is also a big question that comes up, and there are no easy answers to these. I will leave you with two other reflections. One, I think what you talk about, the question that guides your work, how can you get a better sense of history without having to resort to the textbook? A sense of history, a sense of where you come from, what you're connected to. I think those are really important today. And those are very political things in the kind of atmosphere in which we're working today, where a singular sense of history is being put out as the only story to be told. And with the many stories that you might collect that will take you in a different direction, if it's an art archive in Bangladesh of artists who are the first ones to speak out after the war and raising questions of what war and conflict do to art, or if it is stories that lie in your grandfather's trunk, these are the kinds of things that when you put out into the world would, both make a difference and raise issues of vulnerability and so on and so forth. But also they are stories that add to what the textbooks tell us, that nuance what's there in the textbook, that enrich all of that. So I think that part of your project is really important. And another very interesting dimension that is now coming up for me in some work that I have been doing is what you do with memory when there is no archive at all, in the sense that if you're looking at history through objects, as many of you are, whether it's photographs, which you're finding, which tell one kind of story, or it's artworks that tell another kind of story, or it's books, or it's things in a trunk, or it is ghost stories or other stories, you have something to seek out. there is something there you can say is an archive, is the archive, or is not the only archive, is one archive. But when you have nothing, so if you're talking of the histories, and this is a classed history, and it is a caste-laden history of people who do not have the luxury to retain memory other than in their heads, what do you do with those kinds of memories? Objects, for example, which are very interesting today, actually, it's only those who can afford to have objects, who can carry away objects, or who can retain them. If you can't afford to have those, what happens into fragile lives? I have been trying to write a book on a Hijra friend of mine who destroyed every archive that she had. She would write things, she would tear them up, throw them away. She had pictures, she would tear them up, throw them away. And who herself was so changeable in who she thought she was. I mean, she was my only archive. She died a few years ago. She was my only archive to build her story from, but she was a deeply unstable archive. So where does that actually place the person who is recording that? And what is the responsibility then you carry to tell a certain kind of truth? And I have no answer to that, but I find it a very, very interesting and exciting question to ask, because the notion of an archive assumes that there is an object, there is a book, there are papers, there is something you can go to, something physical. And yet there are archives that lie in the head. I know you're looking at oral history, but those are also dependent on people who have a story to tell, and often those stories themselves are changeable. And then what do we do with that changeability? What do we do with the instability of the archive that we want to capture? And I really have no answer to that. So I'm going to stop here. So thank you for listening to me. And if you have any questions or comments, yeah, I can be here for about 10 minutes or so.
Are you able to hear us? We have a central mic, so I want to know if you're audible.
Yeah, I can hear you with difficulty, but I can hear you.
Okay. So first of all, thank you so much for putting in this time. I can tell that you really pieced informations together to understand what these projects were, and I understand the limitation, because Urvashi is not here and she's not seeing what we have put up there. And for that, thank you so much. I will just stop with that, and I'm sure there are questions and responses.
Urvashi?
Yeah, please.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for your talk. And the other side of silence really helped when we were trying to figure things out personally. So, I work with identity and space. The Royal Bengali tiger was my project, and I'm trying to I'm talking about the tiger, but what I'm really trying to talk about is biopolitics of the communities, which are very vulnerable and living right there, and the informal or private knowledges that are just slipping in the process. So one of the things that we are grappling with till date in a very real way when it comes to archiving is that question of speaking on behalf of somebody, right? As opposed to letting them speak, and that question of can the subaltern speak keeps haunting us, and it should. And we are using digital spaces. In fact, I started looking at Ishita's work because of that. And when we talk about digital humanities in classrooms, I have to tell my students that the digital is a very subversive space, or it can be used in very subversive ways. Do you think archiving and digital oral histories, or this connection that we are trying to draw, where we are coming from different disciplines or looking at different spaces, but we are trying to often subvert the mainstream representation or use the very same representation to make completely different meanings out of it, that with digitality will help? Because a lot of books are just not accessible. I had to read a pirated copy of The Other Side of Silence, for instance. So do you think that might help? Not across the board, but depending on the context.
See, I think I'm not somebody who can speak with a lot of knowledge about the digital, but I think perhaps a different way of asking the question is that here in front of us is a technology that offers a lot of potential. Can we as archivists afford to ignore it and say, no, we won't use this technology? I don't think we can. And I think what it does offer us is a range that, let's say, the printed book, in its limitations, does not offer us. I think one of the things in one or other of your projects, I can't remember which one it was, there was a discussion or there was a line that said something about the digital offering more permanence. That's something we don't know. We don't know whether the digital will survive because it's changing also so rapidly that we don't know whether the transfer of information between the different iterations will actually retain what what that information has in its original thing. But I don't think we can afford to ignore it. And I think what it does offer us is the cross-cutting potential of mixing sound with words and even, for example, the kind of questions that you're raising, do we speak on behalf of, or do people speak on their own behalf? And I don't think there's any easy answer to that. I mean, can the subaltern speak, I think, is an incomplete question. Really, to my mind, it should be not can the subaltern speak. Of course, the subaltern can and does speak. But is there anyone to listen? And I think that's the second part of it, which needs to be there. And what we are doing, I think, is listening with responsibility and receiving the trust that is given, and then seeing how we can take that into the world without claiming it for our own, but recognizing our position as interlocutors, if you like, but not people who are neutral. You're not unaffected by what you do. So when I was doing my work on partition, I had to find a way of doing that. People were telling me things, and I knew that I was hearing in those things that they may be not necessarily hearing or being, because that was my receiving. So I had to find a way of prefacing every interview that I carried by saying, this is what this interview meant for me, but here it is, you might read it differently. So in a sense, you have to negotiate that responsibility. And, if you're an academic, the pressures are to do something which will result in more credits, which will help you in your job. But for those of us who are doing this without that pressure on them, I think we have a little more freedom to be able to find sensitive and egalitarian ways to deal with these tricky issues. So I haven't given you an answer, but just some things to think about, perhaps.
Thank you. Thank you.
And
Anyone
sometimes
else?
it's a compliment that your book has been pirated, so I'm glad to hear that.
Anyone else has questions, thoughts?
I can move this side, so if somebody wants to be.
It's okay if there aren't, because, are you
Sorry?
asking something?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
So I have a question, and I have something very, very nice to ask you, but hoping that maybe because you've seen more of these times than us. I'm right now very curious, why suddenly have you started building so many archives? So when you must have started, and when you must have thought about archiving and what we are seeing now, there's hyper archiving, and we all talked about it internally a lot as archivists or accidental archivists. In your understanding, is there a logic to this hyper archiving to do with disconnected or broken identities more so over time? And it's a very naive and a very direct question to the times we are in. That has archiving become a tool to address questions of the self, questions that bother us more internally, more psychologically, more within a certain community where you can fit in? And does that change things for a historian? from point of view of history building? Were archives meant to be something else, and are they becoming something else?
Okay, great question, and I'll respond as best as I can, and then I'll have to go because I have to be somewhere in half an hour, and I need to run. I think yes, archives are changing. The whole idea of an archive being a place where you had records of a certain kind that you would then as a researcher go to. So you had to have a physical location that you went to where you access those records. The digital has changed a lot of that in bringing archives closer to us through our computers and through websites and such like. So that physical journey is not, you don't have to make that. And also the digital has offered much wider kind of access to archives. So that is one thing. But I think also the entry of different kinds of historical ethnographic explorations and a combination of a political moment in which we find ourselves in South Asia, let's say, where really the need to capture different histories is both a political need and a personal need, because you don't want to lose those histories. You know, there is a moment, there was a moment 22 years ago when it became possible to move into looking at partition in a different way. And starting from that time to today, you see a real flowering of different explorations of partition, which have so enriched that study and made us understand its meanings differently. And a lot of those have come from young people looking at films, looking at, I don't know, paintings and so on, things that were never considered worthy of historical exploration. And I think that moment was a moment when, for me, certainly, as Indians who had grown up, you know, believing in the national story and believing in the secular dream, these things began to fall apart around us and we began to raise different questions. And we began to see different realities. I think that's the moment now when many political developments, and I shan't go into detail, are pushing us to look at the variety of histories. The interest in oral history is pushing people to examine their own family histories. And in the doing of that, in the questions that kind of work raises about what is history, what is ethnography, who owns it, what is knowledge, etc., the whole notion of archives and what are archives is getting changed and transformed, I think, in very, very interesting ways. We haven't lost the old thing, but we've gained a whole lot of new things, which is going to lead us in very, very interesting directions. So I think I'll have to stop there, if you'll forgive me for rushing, but thank you. And it's been great. I would love to hear more, but maybe Ishta, I'll watch everything that you've done on YouTube. Yes?
Yes, we'll make sure that it's all accessible and we'll share the links with you. Thank you once again, Urvashi.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye now. Bye.